Chapter 32 of the Turmoil. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, July 2009. The Turmoil, Volume 1 of the Growth Trilogy, by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 32. It was a full hour later when he left her lying upon a couch in her own room, still lamenting intermittently, though he assured her with heat that the fuss she was making irked him far more than his physical loss. He permitted her to think that he meant to return directly to his office, but when he came out to the open air he told the chauffeur in attendance to await him in front of Mr. Vertrees's house, whither he himself proceeded on foot. Mr. Vertrees had taken the sale of half his worthless stock as manna in the wilderness. It came from heaven, by what agency he did not particularly question. The broker informed him that parties were interested in getting hold of the stock, and that later there might be a possible increase in the value of the large amount retained by his client. It might go quite a ways up within a year or so, he said, and he advised sitting tight with it. Mr. Vertrees went home and prayed. He rose from his knees, feeling that he was surely coming into his own again. It was more than a mere grasp of temporary relief with him, and his wife shared his optimism. But Mary would not let him buy back her piano, and as for furs, spring was on the way, she said. But they paid the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, and hired a cook once more. It was this servitress who opened the door for Sheridan, and presently assured him that Miss Vertrees would be down. He was not the man to conceal admiration when he felt it, and he flushed and beamed as Mary made her appearance, almost upon the heels of the cook. She had a look of apprehension for the first fraction of a second, but it vanished at the sight of him, and its place was taken in her eyes by a soft brilliance, while color rushed in her cheeks. "Don't be surprised," he said. "Truth is, in a way, it's sort of on business I looked in here. It'll only take a minute, I expect." "I'm sorry," said Mary. "I hoped you'd come because we're neighbors." He chuckled. "Neighbors! Sometimes people don't see so much of their neighbors as they used to. That is, I hear so, lately. You'll stay long enough to sit down, won't you?" "Oh, I guess I could manage that much." And they sat down, facing each other, and not far apart. "Of course, it couldn't be called business exactly," he said more gravely. "Not at all, I expect. But there's something of yours it seemed to me I ought to give you, and I just thought it was better to bring it myself and explain how I happen to have it. It's this letter you wrote my boy." He extended the letter to her solemnly, in his left hand, and she took it gently from him. "It was in his mail after he was hurt. You knew he never got it, I expect." "Yes," she said, in a low voice. He sighed. "I'm glad he didn't. Not," he added quickly, "not but what you did just right to send it. You did. You couldn't act it any other way when it came right down to it. There ain't any blame comin' to you. You were above board all through." Mary said, "Thank you," almost in a whisper, and with her head bowed low. "You'll have to excuse me for readin' it. I had to take charge of all his mail and everything. I didn't know the handwritin', and I read it all, once I got started." "I'm glad you did." "Well," he leaned forward as if to rise, "I guess that's about all. I just thought you ought to have it." "Thank you for bringing it." He looked at her hopefully, as if he thought and wished that she might have something more to say, but she seemed not to be aware of this glance, and sat with her eyes fixed sorrowfully upon the floor. "Well, I expect I better be gettin' back to the office," he said, rising desperately. I told my partner I'd be back at 2:00, and I guess he'll think I'm a poor businessman if he catches me behind time. I got to walk the chalk a mighty straight line these days, with that fellow keeping tabs on me." Mary rose with him. "I've always heard you were the hard driver." He guffawed derisively. "Me? I'm nothin' to that partner of mine. You couldn't guess to save your life how he keeps after me to hold up my end of the job. I shouldn't be surprised he'd give me the grand bounce some day and run the whole circus by himself. You know how he is, once he goes at a thing." "No," she smiled. "I didn't know you had a partner. I'd always heard—" He laughed, looking away from her. It's just my way of speaking of that boy of mine, Bibbs." He stood then, expectant, staring out into the hall with an air of careless geniality. He felt that she certainly must at least say, "How is Bibbs?" But she said nothing at all, though he waited until the silence became embarrassing. "Well, I guess I'd better be getting down there," he said at last. "He might worry." "Good-bye, and thank you," said Mary. "For what?" "For the letter." "Oh," he said blankly. "You're welcome. Good-bye." Mary put out her hand. "Good-bye." "You'll have to excuse my left hand," he said. "I had a little accident to the other one." She gave a pitying cry as she saw. "Oh, poor Mr. Sheridan!" "Nothin' at all. Dictate everything nowadays, anyhow." He laughed jovially. "Did anybody tell you how it happened?" "I heard you hurt your hand, but no, not just how." "It was this way," he began, and both, as if unconsciously, sat down again. "You may not know it, but I used to worry a good deal about the youngest of my boys, the one that used to come to see you sometimes, after Jim, that is. I mean Bibbs. He's the one I spoke of as my partner. And the truth is, that's what it's just about going to amount to, one of these days, if his health holds out. Well, you remember, I expect. I had him on a machine over at a plant of mine, and sometimes I'd kind of sneak in there and see how he was getting along. Take a doctor with me sometimes, because Bibbs never was so robust, you might say. Old Doc Gurney. I guess maybe you know him. Tall, thin man, acts sleepy? Yes. Well, one day, I and old Doc Gurney, we were in there, and I undertook to show Bibbs how to run his machine. He told me to look out, but I wouldn't listen, and I didn't look out, and that's how I got my hand hurt, trying to show Bibbs how to do something he knew how to do, and I didn't. Made me so mad I just wouldn't even admit it to myself I was hurt. And so, by and by, old Doc Gurney had to take kind of radical measures with me. He's a right good doctor, too. Don't you think so, Miss Vertrees? Yes, he is so. Sheridan now had the air of a rambling talker and gossip with all day on his hands. Take him on Bibbs' case. I was talking about Bibbs' case with him this morning. Well, you'd laugh to hear the way old Doc Gurney talks about that. Of course, he is just as much a friend as he is doctor, and he takes as much interest in Bibbs as if he was in the family. He says Bibbs isn't anyways bad off yet, and he thinks he could stand the pace and get fat on it. Well, this is what'd made you laugh if you'd been there, Miss Vertrees. Honest, it would. He paused to chuckle, and stole a glance at her. She was gazing straight before her at the wall. Her lips were parted, and, visibly, she was breathing heavily and quickly. He feared that she was growing furiously angry, but he had led to what he wanted to say, and he went on, determined now to say it all. He leaned forward and altered his voice to one of confidential friendliness, though in it he still maintained a tone which indicated that old Doc Gurney's opinion was only a joke he shared with her. "Yes, sir, you certainly would 'a' laughed. Why, that old man thinks you got something to do with it. You'll have to blame it on him, young lady, if it makes you feel like startin' out to whip somebody. He's actually got this theory. He says Bibbs got to gettin' better while he worked over there at the shop because you kept him cheered up and feelin' good. And he says if you could manage to just stand hangin' around him a little, maybe not much, but just sometimes, again, he believed it'd do Bibbs a mighty lot of good. Course, that's only what the doctor said. Me, I don't know anything about that, but I can say this much. I never saw any such a mental improvement in anybody in my life as I have lately in Bibbs. I expect you'd find him a good deal more entertaining than what he used to be. And I know it's a kind of embarrassing thing to suggest after the way he piled in over here that day to ask you to stand up before the preacher with him, but according to old Doc Gurney, he's got you on his brain so bad." Mary jumped. "Mr. Sheridan!" she exclaimed. He sighed profoundly. "There, I noticed you were gettin' mad. I didn't—" No, she cried. "But I don't understand, and I think you don't. What is it you want me to do?" He sighed again, but this time with relief. Well, he said, "you're right. It'll be easier to talk plain. I ought to known I could with you all the time. I just hoped you'd let that boy come and see you sometimes once more. Could you?" "You don't understand." She clasped her hands together in a sorrowful gesture. "Yes, we must talk plain. Bibbs heard that I'd tried to make your oldest son care for me because I was poor, and so Bibbs came and asked me to marry him because he was sorry for me. And I can't see him any more," she cried in distress. "I can't." Sheridan cleared his throat uncomfortably. "You mean because he thought that about you?" No. What he thought was true." Well, you mean he was so much in... You mean he thought so much of you... The words were inconceivably awkward upon Sheridan's tongue. He seemed to be in doubt even about pronouncing them, but after a ghastly pause he bravely repeated them. You mean he thought so much of you that you just couldn't stand him around? No, he was sorry for me. He cared for me, he was fond of me, and he'd respected me too much. In the finest way he loved me, if you like, and he'd have done anything on earth for me, as I would for him, and as he knew I would. It was beautiful, Mr. Sheridan, she said, but the cheap, bad things one has done seems always to come back. They wait and pull you down when you're happiest. Bibbs found me out, you see, and he wasn't in love with me at all. He wasn't? Well, it seems to me he gave up everything he wanted to do. It was fool stuff, but he certainly wanted it mighty bad. He just threw it away and walked right up and took the job he swore he never would, just for you. And it looks to me as if a man that'd do that must think quite a heap of the girl he does it for. You say it was only because he was sorry, but let me tell you there's only one girl he could feel that sorry for. Yes, sir. No, no, she said. Bibbs isn't like other men. He wouldn't do anything for anybody. Sheridan grinned. Perhaps not so much as you think nowadays, he said. For instance, I got kind of a suspicion he doesn't believe in sentiment in business. But that's neither here nor there. What he wanted was, just plain and simple, for you to marry him. Well, I was afraid his thinking so much of you had kind of sickened you of him, the way it does sometimes. But from the way you talk, I understand that ain't the trouble. He coughed, and his voice trembled a little. Now here, Miss Vertrees, I don't have to tell you, because you see things easy. I know I got no business comin' to you like this, but I had to make Bibbs go my way instead of his own. I had to do it for the sake of my business, and on his account, too. And I expect you got some idea how it hurt him to give up. Well, he's made good. He didn't come in half-hearted or mean. He came in all the way. But there isn't anything in it for him. You can see he's just shut his teeth on it and going ahead with dust in his mouth. You see, one way of looking at it, he's got nothing to work for. And it seems to me like it cost him your friendship. And I believe, honest, that's what hurt him the worst. Now, you said we'd talk plain. Why can't you let him come back? She covered her face desperately with her hands. I can't. He rose, defeated and looking it. Well, I mustn't press you, he said gently. At that she cried out, and dropped her hands and let him see her face. Ah! He was only sorry for me. He gazed at her intently. Mary was proud, but she had a fatal honesty, and it confessed the truth of her now. She was helpless. It was so clear that even Sheridan, marveling and amazed, was able to see it. Then a change came over him, gloom fell from him, and he grew radiant. Don't, she cried. You mustn't. I won't tell him, said Sheridan from the doorway. I won't tell anybody anything. End of chapter 32.